My goal today is to make the easiest table saw crosscut sled video on YouTube. So there are a number of table saw crosscut videos on YouTube. All kinds of ultimate ones with clamps on them, jigs on them, a bunch of stuff hanging off of them, ones that are way too big, and all of them do the same thing. They cut a 90-degree crosscut. I looked through real quick and just saw a bunch of videos that are like 20 minutes long that are super complicated. There's nothing more frustrating when you're trying to figure out how to do something and the video is just way too long, full of a bunch of crap. So this video is just gonna be the most basic crosscut sled video. You can literally build it in minutes. And all you're gonna need is a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood, not even a full sheet. You probably have some hanging around. You can even go pick up a little project panel from Home Depot, one of the smaller ones, and it's still gonna be more than enough. So let's go. I'm gonna walk you through step by step how to do this. Let's build one. All right, so your first step is going to be to determine the size of the base of your sled. I've made a lot of different sleds for table saws, and my most common error is I usually make it too big. So kind of shy away from that. All you're doing is doing simple crosscuts, and there's no really need to make it that big. For my case, I'm going to be doing 18 by 14. And 18 inches is going to be what spans across the table of the table saw, so I'm going to cut that first at 18 inches. And then I'm just going to take that 18-inch piece, switch my fence to 14 inches on the table saw, and just make a cut there to give me an 18 by 14 inch piece. Now I'm going to take that piece over to my table saw, set it next to the blade. I am going to raise the blade up all the way, and in my case, what sticks above that is 2 inches. Now I want to leave at least an inch above that because the fence is kind of going to be what holds this together. Now with that same piece of plywood I just cut the base out of, that one side is still cut to 18 inches. So then I'm just going to switch the fence to 3 inches and make 4 3 by 18 inch pieces. These are going to make up the fences. With the base and the fence pieces cut, I'm going to turn my attention to the runners, which I'm going to be making out of 1/4 inch plywood. You can pretty much make these out of anything you got though. What I'm going to do is measure the grooves in my table saw. Make sure you measure the top of the grooves. A lot of times below is a lot wider and you want to measure the top. In my case it's just about 3/4 of an inch. I think that's pretty common for them, but be sure to double check. And then I'm just going to rip a first piece down to 3/4 of an inch, as close as I can to it, test fit it. If it's a little loose, I'll go back and cut a couple more. Or if it's too big, obviously you rip a little bit more off. This just might take a little playing around with to get it right, but you want this pretty close. You want this pretty accurate. The whole point of this is to make a very accurate 90-degree cut, so make sure there's no play. I gave my runners just the very slightest sanding. You don't want to go too crazy with this because obviously it'll make them too small. Just enough to knock the edges down. Now, a lot of times these table saws, the slots in them will be a lot deeper than 1/4 inch. So what you're going to want to do, a lot of people stack up pennies to get your runners to stick up over the table saw for glue up. The first 2 runners I cut were too thin anyway, so I'm going to use them. But as you can see here, that makes it stick up a little bit. This will help you a ton for glue up. Now is the time to determine where you would like the blade to come through the sled. Most commonly, you put it through the center of it, which is what I'm going to be doing for this. So since the width of my sled is 18 inches, I'll set my fence to 9 inches, and that is where I will be gluing it up. Glue up's pretty simple. Apply your glue, and then take the base of your sled, and since my fence is set at 9 inches, I can use the fence to orient my glue up. So you put the base right against the fence after your glue is on the runners, and you drop it down and put some weight on it and let it set for a bit. While the runners are drying, I am going to glue up the fences. And what I'm going to do is grab one of my levels, and I'm going to glue up against that. The level is completely straight, and if there's any minor warps in this piece of plywood, being glued up against this level is going to take that away. These are 2 more glue ups I'm just going to let sit and cure all the way through. But if you're in a hurry, you can easily just glue and screw these. Just make sure you glue them up and screw them so they're as straight as you can get them, so they're not offset from each other. Once the glue's all cured, it's time to start putting the rest of this together. First thing I do is the runners are way too long for it, which I do on purpose, and I will use a pole saw to flush them up and cut them off. I'll take it over to the table saw, give it a quick test, make sure it moves really good. And then I will also make a mark where the blade goes. And now I will glue the back fence on. I'm calling it the back fence because as you're sitting facing your table saw, this is going to be the rear of the fence, the one furthest away from you. And the reason I took it over to the table saw and marked where the blade goes is we're going to glue it right where that mark is, and I'm going to be sure not to put a screw on that mark because that is where the blade's going to go through. Now, the glue up of this one does not matter at all if it's square to the blade. I usually just make it flush to the base of the sled, but you're not referencing anything off of this sled. This is basically there to hold the sled together when the blade comes through. So all I do is glue up and screw it. Obviously screw it where the blade isn't going to go through. That's the biggest thing to remember here. Another thing you'll want to remember is to countersink the screws when you're screwing on this fence. You're going to be screwing from the bottom, and the bottom's going to be against the table of your table saw. So you want to make sure the heads of those screws sit well enough underneath that it's not scraping on your table saw. And you can pretty much use any screws you got laying around. I'm using 1 5/8" drywall screws. I wouldn't use anything shorter than 1 1/4", and I probably wouldn't use anything above 2 inches. And now it's going to be time to attach your front fence. This is going to be the fence that's going to be closest to you as you're facing the table saw. And this is the important one. This is the one you're going to want to get right. So in order to do this, what you're going to do is raise up your blade to cut through the base of your sled. And make sure your back fence is obviously away from you. And you want to bring that up to just about the front. You don't want to go all the way through though. You want to keep it supported. So I leave about 2 to 3 inches there. So what I'll do is temporarily clamp that fence on. I'll pretty much bring it to the end and bring it flush, but I'll leave it in like a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch just to give me a little wiggle room for adjustment. I'll flip it over, and what I'm going to do is put a screw in on one side to act as a pivot point to really square it up to the blade before I screw it down on the other side. And then I'll flip it back over. I'll raise my blade up all the way, because what you're going to do is take a square and you're going to square this fence up to the blade. So you want your blade up all the way, and as you can see, I got a pivot point to act on, and I will put the big flat part against my fence and square it right up to the blade. Take your time doing this. This is what's going to make your sled dead on accurate. And what I will do after it's squared up is slide the sled back to me, and I will temporarily clamp this down, making sure, being careful not to move it. Once clamped down, flip the table saw, slide over, and countersink another screw in on the other side opposite of your pivot screw. Now I'm going to put a couple other screws in this as well, but what I first want to do is just test it out and check my speed square against the blade again before I screw it down permanently with more screws. And as you can see here, it is dead on accurate. I will finish that off by countersinking a couple more screws in that fence to hold it down. I did not glue this fence. The trouble with gluing it is it kind of slides around everywhere, and it would be really hard to get an accurate glue up. So I just went with the screws here, and then with the screws as well, if it ever got bumped or whatever and got out of square, you can always unscrew it, drill new holes, and re-screw it so it is completely 90 degrees again. Now, one thing I recommend before using this is to use some sort of polish on the bottom. You can use a paste wax. That is very common. I don't have any paste wax, so I'm just using like this walrus oil furniture polish, but this worked really well. So what I did was just wax up the runners, buff that off, and I also waxed my table saw bed with this too. This will make it glide super smooth on your table saw bed, and after that's done, I will raise my blade up and cut it through the rest of the way, just touching that front fence. Now, I don't really glue on any safety blockers here. I know a lot of people do. If that's what you want to do, definitely feel free to do it. But what I will do is just kind of make some Sharpie marks and kind of just put an X there. This will just be enough of a visual, keep my hands away. I've used these table saw sleds enough where I know obviously not to put my hand behind the blade. But if it is your first table saw sled, it's probably not a bad idea to put a couple stop blocks there. Obviously, just be sure when you're using it to be really aware where that blade is at all times, because it can be a little deceiving with these table saw sleds. Now, obviously that's completely optional, but I do recommend doing something. Another thing optional is I will put a 45-degree chamfer on this just to make it a little easier on the hands so it's not such rough corners. And then I'll just take my little hand sander thing and roughly sand down the edges real quick. Nothing crazy, but it does make it a lot more comfortable when pushing down on it. And then I'll just give this a quick test, cut it through, and test that it's perfectly 90 degrees. And as you can see here, it is dead on. Hey guys, if you enjoyed that video, I think you'll really like this one down here where I build a drawer box in 5 minutes. Stay tuned on the channel and I'll catch you in the next one. Hey, where the heck did you guys come from?